He has no skills, no income, no future, the other lawyer says, as if reading the page of my life aloud for the first time. The courtroom hums around the words, the dull scrape of the judge's pen, the hard cough from the back row, the fluorescent light that makes everything look too bright and too small. Someone shifts in their seat. Mark doesn't look at me. He never does when someone else is looking. He only ever looks when he wants confirmation. My lawyer looks at me instead. Her face is calm in that way lawyers are when they've mapped every bend in a river and know where the rapids are. "Can you tell the court about the company you've been running for the past 8 years?" she asks. The room leans forward as if someone has opened a window. I breathe in. I let the steam of those years fill me for a second, and then I speak. But before I get to that moment, before any courtroom pages get turned, I need you to go back with me almost a decade. To understand why I sat in that chair being called no future, you have to see the promises I made, the ones I unmade, and the small, stubborn choices that became the thing people called my life. 10 years earlier, I was standing in an office that smelled faintly of new paint and expensive polish. A promotion letter was on the desk between us, and champagne sat in a bucket on ice because Mark liked ceremonies, bought and popped, glitter in the sinks, photos for his phone. He clinked my glass and said the words that would change everything. "You don't need to keep juggling. Let me provide. Be home. Be us." I did it because love tasted like warmth and relief. I did it because after a decade of balancing grocery inventory and staff schedules with laundry lists and PTA nights, the offer meant I could breathe. He sounded proud. I wanted to be the kind of partner who accepted without questioning. So I handed in my resignation with hands that didn't tremble, at least not where he could see, and folded my career into a neat envelope. At first it was how I had imagined a quieter life might be. Slow Saturdays, church committee meetings that ended with 2 sweet coffee and lemon bars, volunteering at the children's center, lunches with neighbors. I arranged our home like a lover arranges a room, neatly to please. I gave him space to shine. It felt like the right trade. What I didn't understand then was that asking me to stop working was the first small architecture of control he would build around me. It was invisible at the start. The lights were always on, but the door had shifted in its frame. The erosion wasn't theatrical. It was 100 tiny things that add up. A text every hour asking where I was, comments about how dressy I looked when I went out, jokes he made in front of his friends about my wife who doesn't need a checkbook. He began to track our spending in a way that felt like diligence, and then like ledgered suspicion. He took the car keys for the day, and I found them in his sock drawer. When I questioned it, he would look surprised, as if my confusion was unreasonable, and remind me gently of how lucky I was to have someone handling the heavy stuff. Isolation sanded away pieces of me. Friends started to drift out through the cracks of missed calls and unreturned invites. Weeks, he said, were just busy, stretched into months. The more I shrank into the role I'd accepted, the more his words turned from requests into prescriptions. I became the unpaid administrator of a well-run service. Clean counters, meals on the table, the right sort of smile when he brought friends home. I kept to the rhythms of the day. Church choir on Sundays, the volunteer bake sale in October, game nights. On paper, I was precisely what he'd asked me to be. Inside there was a persistent blank where my professional life had been. Then my grandmother, Graham everyone called her, got sick. She wasn't flashy. She wrapped her life in practicality, a tin of loose-leaf tea, a stack of old newspapers, a garden that was a mess of tomatoes, and stubborn hope. She had been the first person to tell me, with a look that crumpled and softened at the edges, that my stubbornness was never a thing to be hidden. "You'll use it when you need it," she said once, pressing a folded scrap of paper into my hand, with the kind of seriousness only she could muster. When she died, we went through the motions. There was grief that landed like a heavy shawl, and there were practical things like funeral arrangements and the sorting of decades. In her kitchen drawer, wrapped in a rubber band, I found an envelope addressed to me in her thin, old-fashioned script. Inside was 30 pages of grocery lists, and folded flat and worn at the creases, a check, $45,000. Across the memo line she had written, in the sort of shorthand she used in her notes, Escape Fund. It felt like a small electric theft to read that word, escape. Not because she wanted me to run, but because she knew life freighted with other people's expectations could calcify. She had always been a private revolutionary. When she handed me that envelope, she pressed my hand and said, "Don't tell anyone yet. Use it for you. What I do next is the part that divides opinions." I was not proud of hiding anything. I was hiding out of a very precise fear that whatever independence I tried to stitch back into my life would be unpicked by a man whose thought being a provider gave him a right over my choices. I didn't want a fight I couldn't win to begin the moment I started to reclaim myself. So I did what any person with a thin thread of courage and very limited options might do. I drove to a neighborhood that felt like a map of the city I used to know. Corner stores, a crooked door that had seen better paint, a morning routine of people who knew the sound of the same doorbell. I found a place that had once been a bakery and then a laundromat and then nothing at all. The owner wanted it off his hands. The price, $38,000, was less than the number on the check, but enough to make my stomach do a small, shocked flip. I told no one, not Mark, not my sisters, not even Graham, because she was gone. I signed papers under my maiden name. I opened a business account that used my old name, the one I had stopped using in more formal cases after marriage. I bought a prepaid phone that I kept in the glove compartment. When I say I did it in secret, I mean it. The cafe, which would come to be called the Corner Cup, existed for me in a private geography. 3 in the morning, store lights off, a key turned quietly in a lock no one heard. The first morning I opened the Corner Cup, I woke before dawn. I remember the way the city felt at 3:45 a.m., like a held breath. The street lamps pooled their halos on wet pavement. I staggered into the kitchen, hands still raw from the paperwork and the small theft of courage I'd been living with. The steam wand hissed. The milk curdled into a hand-done froth that tasted like newness and terror. I burned my thumb on a silver spout and didn't cry. Burning became another confession, a proof that I was doing it myself. Rita was there that first week, the woman who would become my anchor in the beginning. She'd worked in cafes for longer than most places in our part of town had existed, and she smelled of cigarettes and cinnamon. She had a laugh, like someone who spent her life enjoying things other people made complicated. "You look like you could use a stool and a shock blanket," she told me when she saw my hands. She stayed because she saw what the place could be, and because she didn't ask for the paper trail of my life to figure it out. There were other regulars who arrived like bookmarks. Frank, who had been retired from the post office long enough to know how to whittle a day. Linda, who ordered the same tea with 2 sugars and had a way of listening as if she were measuring you for a coat. David, who worked on an old laptop and seemed to be constantly on the cusp of a solution. They didn't know my last name on the sign. They knew the barista who made a mean cappuccino and the woman who insisted on using the chipped blue mug, even though I told her it was a disaster in terms of appearance. The early months were choreography and improvisation. I learned the coffee machine by ear. The sigh of a proper shot, the wrongness of a pulled espresso. I learned to soothe a barista shift's worth of drama with no diploma, but with an unshakable stubbornness. We screwed in mismatched stools because that was what we could afford. An old cash register jammed on a 7 and refused to budge. It became part of the charm and part of my irritation. Receipts were kept in a shoebox. I counted the till with the kind of care I had once used to balance company inventory sheets. The money that came through the sliding window of the corner cup was my secret ledger, literal coin and change, and the intangible accumulation of mornings. I hired people who had been told they were too damaged to employ. Jasmine was a teen who had one bad semester and a bad foster placement, but a laugh that cut through morning fog. Bobby had done time and knew how to feed a room with warmth and a pan. Maria was an immigrant baker who made bread as if the yeast obeyed her on principle. I watched them come in with the weight of their pasts and leave with shoulders that unknotted by degrees. Paying them well was never a public statement. It was how I repaid the quiet debt of someone else's faith. On my end, I kept 2 books of life. There was the house, where Mark's presence ran like a slow, steady drone, where he bought things I didn't need and asked me in the evening what we'd had for dinner as if he hadn't been home. There was the cafe, where people called me Sarah, no surname, no marital anchor, and where, in a corner I occupied, I framed the folded note from Graham and stuck it behind the register like a talisman. I couldn't say aloud what I had done. I could only press my thumb to the paper and remember someone saying, years before, that there should always be a crack for light. Profit came like a cautious tide. In the first few months, it was not enough to make me relax. It was enough to buy better beans and to replace the chipped sign with a hand-painted one that said Corner Cup and leaned precariously on its post. I started depositing small sums into the account in my maiden name. Each deposit felt like a quiet theft and a newly made promise. The money was small at first, one weekend's petty cash, a week of the till, but it multiplied into something steadier as the months became a slate of routines. There were nights I fell into bed and felt the old shame visiting like an unwanted cousin. Keeping secrets has its own loneliness. I would sit at the foot of our bed and listen to Mark practice his speech for a dinner, or hear the television droning with a talk show host's sympathetic laugh, and think how easy it would be to confess. But I thought of Graham's handwriting, those hasty loops, and the way she'd once leaned in and said, "Save some for yourself." I imagined a future where I could say it aloud and not have to tuck my life into drawers. The moral shape of what I did was never easy. I wasn't trying to sabotage anyone. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to survive him. There were nights I would lie awake planning how to tell him and then decide not to risk a thing before I had a roof to sleep under and employees to answer to. I had seen what happens when someone tries to reclaim power without a plan. People get hurt. Friends get cut. I wasn't trying to create a martyr story. I was trying to get to a place where I could be myself without fear. And so I kept the radio on low and the coffee machine higher and learned the algebra of rotation. 2 shifts, a repair bill, a Sunday morning rush. I learned to hand off the clean cut of our life, laundry, grocery lists, neighborly obligations, without tipping him off to the grimy engine grinding pleasantly in the background. When he asked what I did all day, I said the same thing any good actor says: home stuff. It was both true and not. There were small triumphs. The first time a customer left a note saying, "Best latte in town," I felt as if a stranger had given me back my name. Rita taped it above the station where we made drinks, where burned thumbs and shaky hands were visible proof of learning. The first month we turned a modest profit. I cried at closing, and the barista who was on shift that night, Emma only a week in, looked at me like she had been handed a mystery. "You okay?" she asked. I said yes, and meant it in that moment. We began to expand slowly. A second location presented itself as a for-lease sign in a neighborhood where people liked to sit outside and read. I negotiated it by showing up early, by proving to the landlord that I had paying customers and staff who came back every morning. I took a small loan from a community bank with terms that made me swallow, and then took another when that one was paid off. Expansion was not glamorous. It was a spreadsheet of headaches and a steady churn of staff, training, and late-night stalking. But the place where I had been reducing myself to just a wife was growing shoes I could step into. Along the way, the day-to-day of owning a business taught me something more than how to pull a good espresso. It taught me how to see people. Hiring Jasmine, Bobby, Maria, that wasn't charity. It was a practice in noticing the human being beneath the label. Jasmine showed up with unsteady handwriting and a brittle smile. I showed her how to count change and to be on time. She learned to take pride in small victories. Bobby surprised everyone by inventing a breakfast sandwich that sold out on Sundays. Maria brought recipes that smelled like the country she'd come from. The cafe was a small living organism of second chances. When I paid them, they paid me back in loyalty. There were costs, too. There was the constant accounting in my head of what I was hiding. I remember once ringing Mark about a broken heater in the house and watching him respond to the inconvenience as if money were a physical thing he could throw. He was generous in public and miserly in private. When he lost at the poker table, when random withdrawals from our joint funds didn't add up, I told myself I must be misremembering. That denial is a soft, poisonous place to live, built on hope and on the fear of what happens when you name a thing. Denial kept me moving forward. The cafe's rhythm gave me a steady center. I learned to take the heat and then to move through it. I learned how to tool a business out of a check from a woman who liked to tend tomatoes and whose hands always smelled faintly of tea. I learned how to turn a corner space into a place where people felt seen. We were small, 3, then 4 locations over a few years, but each one felt like a brick added to a home I was building for myself. There were days when I thought I had finally found a way to be both the woman who made lives of other people easier and the woman who was unafraid of her own hands. And then, almost like a rumor at first, there were signs that the life inside the house was fraying. He would come home with new clothes he hadn't admitted buying. He would spend hours in the garage with his phone turned face down. He would make a joke at dinner about the time I used to do numbers and laugh as if the joke landed on him alone. I kept the accounts separate. I kept the receipts folded and the deposit small. I watched the till like a parent watches a sleeping child. I framed my grandmother's note behind the register where the light hit it each morning. The cafe's doorbell chimed like a small jurisdictional law. When it rang, the world inside moved like a clock. Outside that door was a life that was not what I'd been told to become. I loved what I built. I wanted it to be mine. By the time the second cafe was humming, the corner cup had regulars at every hour. We had by then about 47 people on payroll across locations. At least, that was the number the accountant put in the report when she came twice a year. We were small enough to feel like a family, and large enough to be a place for people to learn. I had begun to mentor women who came in on their own edges of crisis. Mothers down on their luck, women who'd been told they couldn't return to work. I taught them the basics, not as lessons, but as ways to claim space. Still, the household imbalance continued. Mark's spending never seemed to meet the same standards as my investments. He started a hobby of trips he didn't really explain, and always came home with a story that altered just enough depending on who asked. I told myself it would level, that the steady months of business would make the math obvious and the tension obsolete. There were many times I almost told him everything. I rehearsed the confessions while stirring the milk. I pictured his face when he found out we had 2 more shops and almost vomited with the fear of the argument. I imagined the night someone might knock on my cafe door and say words like, "Your marriage," in a courtroom voice. I did not want to put my employees through the fallout of something that could leave them without a job. So I kept working. I kept learning. Coffee became a language I could speak that didn't require permission. The clientele learned my habits. I always closed the shop with a thinker's frown and a quiet hum, and then would lock the door and drive back to the house where everything else was the same. I kept the facade of domesticity because it was safer for a while than the alternative. One autumn morning, on a day with a sky the color of clean linen, I found a receipt in a laundry pocket. It was small and unremarkable, just a strip of paper with numbers and a place name. It wouldn't have meant much if not for the pattern that later revealed itself. Small withdrawals, a card at an unrecognizable casino, little purchases in late hours. It was the sort of thing you notice only if you are trained to look for discrepancies. I folded the receipt back into the pocket and smoothed the shirt as if nothing was there. I was still not ready to confront the possibility. That was the hard, strange decade that led me back to the courtroom. I gave up a career for love in the way people do when they are in the middle of a sentence with someone. They assume the sentence will continue and make room. I believed something called marriage would be a partnership that made room for both of us. Instead, it became a different kind of architecture, one that assumed my life as collateral to his choices. And yet, within that architecture, thanks to the stubbornness of an old woman and the early morning hours of a sleep-deprived barista, I carved a life back into being. When my lawyer asked the court to hear about the company I had been running, she didn't do it to shame anyone. She did it to perform a fact, that out of a supposedly empty life, I had built 7 rooms that welcomed people in, gave them steady paychecks, and offered them dignity. She pulled the thread where other people had tried to fray it. There are moments in this story that look from the outside like a single brave act. But what I know now is that bravery, in my case, was 1,000 small, often messy choices. A check folded into a drawer, a prepaid phone, a chipped mug kept in service because someone loved it, an employee given a chance when everyone else said no. I am telling you this because when the court murmurs no skills, they mean numerical degrees that can be ticked off on a form. They do not see the skill of patience, the muscle of daily labor, the math of supply and demand learned by touch and trial. They do not see the nights I bandaged my own burns, or the mornings I opened the doors with a resolve that was not loud but was relentless. And still, there were fractures I couldn't have fixed with more whipped milk or a better bean. The secrecy that saved me for years also kept me from being wholly honest with myself and with others. It was a complicated survival. It was not clean. I never intended for it to be drama. I intended for it to be shelter. If you are listening and have been told you have no future because your resume doesn't fit the boxes someone else set, I want you to know that futures are not only built from titles. They are hammered out in the quiet hours of work. They are negotiated in the whispers behind closed doors. They can be stubborn things. There is a point where this story tilts from the quiet reclamation to something colder. Betrayals start small and then claim territory, and money that should have been shared is redirected. There are hints of gambling and unnamed late-night texts and a teenager with a phone who knows how to take a picture. There are receipts that do not belong to me. But those are the chapters that come later, where quiet gives way to confrontation. Right now, the corner cup is still warm. The steamed milk still has the scent of a morning a woman once stole back for herself. Rita calls out orders with the ease of someone who knows her place in the world. Jasmine is learning to manage a till without shaking. Maria has a new pastry on the chalkboard that sends a crowd into a small, appreciative murmur every time she brings it out. I sit behind the register with Graham's folded note tucked not so secretly into the drawer. I have learned to measure life in cups and in small, honest transactions. When the judge looks at me now, and the other lawyer sums up my life in 3 small sentences, they think they're drawing a conclusion. They think they have the whole picture. They don't know about the nights I closed with my hands aching from making the world a serviceable place. They don't know the names of the people who rely on this small, stubborn place. So I tell them. I tell them about a woman who planted a tomato and passed me an envelope. I tell them about burnt thumbs and early mornings. I tell them about regulars who became a community. I tell them about the 47 people who rely on the paychecks and the shifts and the dignity of being chosen. I tell them, not because I want to hurt anyone, but because the truth has weight and sometimes it lightens a room. The air in the courtroom shifts when my lawyer pulls out ledgers and employee statements and tax returns. You can almost hear the balance settle, but the story is far from over. I still have to face conversations I have been avoiding. I still have to decide what to do with a marriage that has become a ledger of hurt. I still have to reckon with the human cost of secrets, my own and his. For now, though, let me end this hour beside the espresso machine, where the hiss of steam is a heartbeat and the chipped blue mug is a flag of my small, steady rebellion. Let me leave you with the image of the folded note in my palm and the smell of a cafe that once saved me. There will be a moment later in this room when a photograph will make everything new again. But that has to do with what comes after the next morning, and right now the next morning is still mine to make. If this story matters to you, if you believe in second chances as much as I do, subscribe and stay with me. There is more to come. That photograph is the thing that changes the tenor of everything. Emma, who was 16 and spent summer afternoons at the corner cup sweeping kisses of sugar off the floor like it was a sacred duty, sent me a message that morning. You need to see this. She put one image on my screen, a shadowed corner of a motel lobby, Mark's jacket draped over a chair, a phone on the armrest with a woman's name lighting up the screen, BR. The girl's face was turned away. The timestamp matched a withdrawal on the bank slip I'd found months before. Seeing it was like being handed both a map and a pair of gloves. Suddenly I could handle the mess. It was not truth delivered like a hammer, but like a cold wind that clarifies. I sat down on a stool that had once wobbled under a customer's weight and felt my muscles unclench. The photograph didn't ruin my life. It made a corridor visible. I called Patricia. I didn't call Mark. I called Patricia. She arrived at the corner cup with her bag, and a quiet that is not emptiness, but the kind of concentration people bring to complicated sewing. She listened to me, how I had built things, how I had kept accounts separate, how I had been careful. She asked for documents. She asked for names. She asked for the usual legal things, but she also asked for what I might not want to show. The receipts I had folded into pockets, the deposits I'd been ashamed to make, the way my accountant put together tax returns to show profit without giving away the secret of the name on the sign. Patricia never flinched at the secrecy. She called it what it was, a survival tactic in a marriage where independence could provoke a dangerous response. She gathered what she needed with a surgeon's precision. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table and made lists. Employee testimonials came first. Rita, Jasmine, Bobby, Maria. All of them wrote things that read like low, stubborn chants of reality. Schedules kept, paychecks on time, second chances that led to new starts. Emma wrote a note about the photo and about how she'd watched Mark's habit of late nights become a pattern. The accountant pulled up bank statements and highlighted a sequence. Withdrawals from the joint account, transfers that didn't match bills, an owner draw that in one recent year had eclipsed plausible household spending, $180,000 in a year, where the household lifestyle did not explain that number. I will not say the court case was theatrical. It was procedural, slow, and laced with small humiliations. Mark's lawyer, Richard, operated with the cool certainty of someone who thinks paperwork will always beat lived experience. In mediation, he painted me the way he'd been paid to paint me, as a woman who'd given up a career and accepted a quiet life, one whose income was the shadow of a husband's. He said those words with the practiced ease of someone who has spent years asking courts to see women's lives as dependent by default. He tried to make my secrecy look like a fraud, not a lifeboat. There were nights when I wanted to shout everything, because the truth is, when you keep a life secret, it eats your appetite for all polite phrases. There were nights when I wanted to show him the deposit slips, the accounts, the staff list with their phone numbers and addresses, because he couldn't possibly have claimed to be the only adult in the household if he saw the payroll. But I knew the risk of that bluntness. I had employees who depended on their shifts for their rent. I had a cafe that would shutter if an argument at home turned into something uglier. Patricia reminded me that revealing everything too early could jeopardize more than my marriage. She also reminded me that the evidence we had could be marshaled to protect the people who worked for me. When I was served with the divorce papers, the world held its breath in a different key. The papers were blunt instruments. They named property, custody of nothing, we had no children, and a proposed settlement that assumed my life had no independent economic value. I walked into the corner cup that day with the envelope in my bag and the radiator steaming its thin steam. The morning crowd greeted me with their ordinary needs: a double espresso, a corner table, a quiet slice of apple bread. I made each drink with the same hands that had once balanced company inventories. Those hands trembled a little but did their work. Depositions followed. I sat under fluorescent lights and answered questions that felt like needles. Richard questioned my motives, my timeline, my reasons for not telling Mark. He used a voice that assumed the worst. He asked whether I'd lied about the money, whether I'd defrauded my husband. He made me spell out numbers. He made me justify the existence of a business that had fed people and paid them. Patricia answered with facts and an evenness that made Richard's theatrics shrivel to something small. One slow afternoon before trial, he sent a mediator an email that boiled my anger down to a sentence. She has no skills, no income, no future. The email was intended as a dagger. It was a gale. But it also set the stage for the thing we all wanted, to make visible what he had tried to hide from a court measured in definitions he thought would pin me down. Preparation is an odd intimacy. We spent weeks organizing exhibits. Tax returns were laid out like the bones of a body, bank statements like veins, deeds like hard-knuckled hands. Patricia called witnesses. Rita agreed to write a statement about how the corner cup had been her home. Jasmine, who had learned to manage a morning rush, sent an email about how being given a job changed the arc of her week. Bobby wrote a letter about the dignity of being paid a fair wage after prison. Maria wrote about arriving in a new country and finding a place to knead dough that made her feel useful again. Emma provided the images she had taken of Mark's late-night meetings and the texts she'd recorded where BR's name appeared. We rehearsed testimony like musicians rehearsing a piece that had never been played in public. Not because there was anything performative about our reality, but because a courtroom is a place that rewards narrative clarity, and the truth, as it lived in our days, was messy. We needed to present that mess in a way the judge could parse, that secrecy had been protection, not theft, that the business preceded any fabricated claim, that I had no means. The day of trial had a weather that felt like a careful witness. Mild, the light filtered through courthouse windows, as if the building itself were trying to stay neutral. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper, and something municipal that always seems to gather in rooms like that. Old Polish and the tang of too many conversations. When I walked in, Mark's expression was flat, a practiced lack of interest. He did not look at me. He looked at his counsel, as if the man was a mirror that reflected back a version of him that was acceptable. Patricia moved through the opening like a craftsman describing a machine they'd built. She did not indict. She laid out. She placed one document after another on the table. A printout of deposits into an account under my maiden name, payroll summaries, leases for the openings of new locations, deeds and the purchase agreement for the first cafe. $38,000 on the line, like a scar that had healed into currency. She called me to the stand. They asked questions. Some were small, manageable. Did I sign these documents? Yes. Did I file taxes? Yes. How many locations? 6 across our neighborhoods. How many employees? 47 on payroll at present. It felt odd to count ourselves as if we were an inventory list, but I said the numbers and felt them stack like bricks. Then came the evidence that felt less like paperwork and more like the audible click of a lock opening. Patricia asked me to tell the court how the business started. I spoke about Graham's check and the folded note in her handwriting that called the Money and Escape Fund. I explained why I'd used my maiden name to purchase the first shop. I explained why I had a prepaid phone. I said the words survival and protection into a room of strangers who were being asked to decide whether those words carried weight. Richard rose to cross-examine. He asked about motivations, about secrecy, about whether I'd intended to deceive. He wanted to make the narrative small. He wanted to reduce my life to a single motive, selfishness. I answered with what I knew to be true, that secrecy had been a lock and a shield at once, that I had not taken the money to ruin a man, but to make a life for the people who now relied on it. The most decisive moment in that courtroom came not from me, but from the people who had little to gain from standing in the room. Rita's testimony was modest and full of the kind of facts that cannot be made up. The dates she worked, the schedules, the regular customers who relied on the shop for breakfast, the bank deposits she had watched me make, and the paychecks she had seen arrive. Jasmine spoke with the nervous clarity of someone who had known what it was to be turned away, and had been given instead a schedule and a set of tasks that let her build trust in herself. Bobby's statement was honest in all its bluntness. Employment had given him structure. The work had helped him become predictable in the best way. Maria talked about bread and how, in learning to bake for people who expected the same warmth every morning, she had learned to expect consistency from herself. Emma testified quietly about what she had photographed. Late-night meetings at a motel across town, a woman's name in a message thread, a pattern of receipts that did not align with family expenses. Her testimony was not theatrical. It was simply factual. She spoke about what she'd seen as a neighbor and a customer. To a room that had been primed to think of me as talentless, her images were a mirror. Patricia put the pieces on the table methodically, the photographs showing where Mark had been, the credit card slips for casinos stitched with late nights, the bank statements revealing transfers that did not match household expenses. She showed tax returns that reflected the income of the corner cop under my maiden name. She produced leases and deeds showing expansion, payroll reports showing 47 employees, and the lender agreements for the second and third locations that proved a pattern of legal business expansion. There was silence as the judge perused the stack. Silence in a courtroom has a temperature. It's the moment before a verdict becomes an action. Judge Morrison looked up with a face that had seen many small human catastrophes and had the habit of observing them in a way that rendered them understandable and less apocalyptic. The ruling was not a cinematic thunderbolt. It was precise. The judge recognized that the corner cup was a viable enterprise that provided wages and dignity for dozens of people. She recognized the sequence of events, the $45,000 check marked Escape Fund, the purchase price of $38,000 for the first shop, and the expansion that followed. She found that the community and economic value of the business, as evidenced by tax returns, bank statements, payroll records, and employee testimony, were tangible and independent. Judge Morrison ruled that I would retain the corner cup and the home we had been living in. She found that the evidence revealed marked significant withdrawals and patterns of gambling and extramarital conduct that impacted joint finances. She ordered that neither party receive spousal support moving forward. It sounded clinical in the room, 3 simple adjudications that felt like a small light in a dim corridor. For me, the relief was not only legal but practical. Keeping the business meant keeping paychecks flowing for 47 people. It meant keeping the place where Jasmine was learning how to manage shifts, where Maria's braids still made people pause, where Bobby's sandwiches sold out on Sundays. When the gavel came down, I felt something like water letting go of my hands. People in the room looked at me with a kind of softened curiosity, as though they had expected me to crumble and had been surprised to see someone who did not. Mark sat very still. His face did not show shame or regret. It showed the flatness of someone whose map of the world had been altered and who might be too exhausted to redraw the lines. The day after the ruling, the corner cup felt both the same and impossible to deny. The steam wand still hissed. The chipped blue mug still sat in its place, a small, stubborn flag. But the register sang a different song now. Employees came to the back and hugged in a way that made me feel less like an impostor and more like a person who had been given permission to stay. The aftermath was not a montage of triumph. There was practical work to be done, transferring leases and accounts out of my maiden name shell into legal recognition, smoothing employee paperwork, answering questions from banks who suddenly took a keener interest. There were also the social repairs of life unspooling. Friends who had kept silent for years reached out with awkward apologies. There were neighbors who had been unsure how to act now that lines had been drawn. I did not gloat. Patricia never let me gloat. She reminded me often that justice is not charity, and that victory does not erase all pain. We settled some things quietly, and left others to muffled conversations that will never have dramatic closure. Mark moved out. He took some of the things he had bought. I kept the plants he had never watered. His absence made the house quieter, which was both terrifying and strangely merciful. In the months that followed, I moved my life a little closer to the corner cup. There was a small apartment above the second location, with 3 windows that looked over a street where children still biked and an old woman sat to peel apples for pies. I liked the closeness to the shop. I liked being able to hear the bell when someone came in and to be there for every morning shift. It felt like the right rearrangement of priorities. The woman who had once given up a career to be a wife now slept where she could hear the hiss of steam. We grew, not because I wanted to prove something, but because the places we built were needed. In time, the corner cup had 6 locations across neighborhoods that had once seemed to make little room for small businesses. The number of employees hovered around 47, which felt like a kind of constellation of people who had given me a reason to keep going. We opened each new shop with the same modest rituals. Rita would arrive to help set tables, Jasmine would check the hours, Maria would bring a loaf or 2 to sell mid-morning, Bobby would test a sandwich for a crowd. We did something else too. I started free startup classes on Tuesday evenings at the original corner cup. The room filled with women who had been given judgments like the ones I'd heard in court. Too old, too broken, too inexperienced. I taught them what I had learned the hard way. How to count till, how to hire someone who needs a second chance, how to make a schedule that lets a parent work school hours, basic ways to set up a ledger without being intimidated by the language of finance. I was careful about what I said. I refused to offer legal prescriptions or promises that every small shop would become 6 locations. I told stories. I handed out checklists that were practical, not prescriptive. I invited lawyers and accountants sometimes to sit in and answer questions, and we had afternoons where a bank officer would come and explain in plain English what lenders look for. But the heart of it was always the mentorship. Rita became the manager of the first shop. She insisted on being paid like a manager and on having a say in hiring. Jasmine came to manage shifts across 2 locations. She had the steady hands of someone who had once been volatile and had learned the comfort of a routine. Bobby was promoted to head of kitchen operations. He trained a small course of cooks who otherwise would not have had a job. Maria started a little corner of imported pastries that became the talk of a neighborhood. Each promotion was noted quietly in the staff room with a cake or coffee and a chorus of small, real enthusiasm. We instituted a hiring policy that prioritized people with employment gaps or criminal records, but it was not charity. It was high standard and high expectation. We paid above minimum when we could. We offered flexible hours for parents. We kept a small emergency fund for employees who had sudden needs. We ran a program where the first month of employment would include a basic financial primer and help setting up a savings account. We were not a charity. We were a workplace that treated dignity like a product. People began to tell me their stories on napkins and the backs of receipts. A woman named Tamika said she'd been twice turned down for jobs because she had a year off to care for her mother. We trained her in barista work, and she became so precise that people at the third location would come in specifically for the way she finished a latte art heart. A man named Luis, who had walked into the Corner Cup after a rough patch, started arriving early and left with a plan to attend trade school. These were not grand rescues. They were small arcs of trust. My mornings now begin the way they always had in the secret life, unlocking a door, pressing the light switch, listening to the hiss of a machine waking up. I make a coffee with the same care I once used to manage inventory. I frame Graham's folded note and hang it near the deposit box. Sometimes I pull it down and smooth its crease as if it would reveal an instruction. Mostly it's a reminder. Someone thought I deserved an exit, and I used it to build an entrance. If you ask whether I regret quitting that promotion a decade ago, the answer is complicated. There is grief for the part of me that was unlived. There is a quiet ache for those missed office banterings and for the career I had left behind. There is also gratitude for the path I carved from the fragments of a forced choice. Love can ask things of you that are not always noble. Sometimes those asks are the first brick in a wall of control, but from the rubble of what I lost, I built a room and then another. I am not a flawless heroine. I made choices to hide that were hard to justify in any ethical sense beyond self-preservation. I am careful to say that concealment is not an ideal. It is sometimes a reaction to being boxed in by someone else's appetite for control. When I teach those Tuesday night classes, I always include a line about ethics. The things that help you survive are not necessarily things you build a life upon without reflection. And yet, survival sometimes requires a practical plan that feels like deceit. I cannot pretend otherwise. People now bring me their own stories. They ask me how I dug my way out. I tell them honest things, that it took steady work, that it took other people's faith in me, that it took legal representation that believed in the factual weight of what I'd done. I do not offer a recipe. I do not promise that every secret will yield a river. I offer instead the modest faith that the dignity of labor is a kind of proof in the world. You make something people need. They give you a reason to continue. There are days when I still see Mark in the reflection of a window and feel an old, small panic. Those days are fewer now. There are nights I lie awake and consider how funny it is that a life can be mapped in receipts and in the smell of coffee. There are afternoons when a woman brings her child to the shop and tells me she came because her mother used to bring her here to study. Those afternoons make the ledger of my life richer in a currency numbers can't measure. Sometimes people ask me about revenge. They expect a story that culminates in a dramatic exposure followed by ruin. This was not that story. What happened in the courtroom was a legal accounting of facts. It was not revenge. It was, if anything, an order being restored to a ledger that had been misused. I feel no joy in Mark's losses. I feel cautious relief about the justice that allowed me to keep providing for people who needed employment and a safe place to work. The Corner Cup continues to run with the familiar chorus of a place that is both business and belonging. We now hold a workshop every month for women thinking about starting a business. Sometimes I bring in a guest like Patricia to speak about practical legal issues in broad terms. What a contract is, what a lease looks like, how to look for a trustworthy accountant. We run a mentoring circle where employees can ask questions about anything from wages to childcare options. We have a bulletin board that lists local resources, not in sterile legal language, but in friendly neighborly fonts. Rita occasionally brings a cake to the staff room and says, "For the early days." We eat it with a sense that this is a kind of calendar marking. Here is where we were. Here is where we cook ourselves simple gratitudes. Jasmine now runs the third shop's morning shifts without a tremor. Bobby's breakfast sandwich is on the morning menu at every location. Maria opened a small pastry stall at a local market where she sells loaves on Saturdays. I still put the folded note behind the register sometimes when I am feeling insecure. I keep it visible. It was a gift that taught me two things: that someone else could see me clearly, and that a small amount of money, used with intention, can become a lever. I do not romanticize the circumstances that made me take the lever. I only acknowledge what was. A woman approached me last week after a workshop. She was in her 50s and getting back into the workforce after a long illness. She asked quietly whether she could apply for a morning job. We spoke while we arranged pastries on a tray. She told me that in the hospital nurses had kept her going. Now she wanted to keep herself going. I looked at her hands and thought of Graham's hands and of my own. I offered her a shift. If you have listened to this and felt a part of your own life move, tell me what landed with you. Was it the photograph? The folded note? Rita's steady hands at the pass? Comment with the moment that touched you most. Let us be a place where moments like these can be kept and traded for company. If you want to hear more stories, real, imperfect, stubborn, subscribe. I will share more of what the mornings smell like and what the people tell me when they think the room is private. Every morning I unlock the door to the corner cup, and for a second I stand there with my hand on the handle and think of all the things I gave up and all the things I built. Love asked for a different life from the one I had planned. Betrayal asked for a reckoning. The reckoning didn't undo the love I felt, but it taught me how to make a life that belonged to me and to others. I keep Graham's note in a frame now on the little desk behind the register. The creases have softened. The ink has faded just a little. I touch the glass sometimes as if it were warm. Then I lift the latch, push the crooked door open, and let the morning in.